Hello, everyone. In this week of our class, I want to provide some videos to you that center on the letter to the Hebrews and center particularly on the first chapter of that letter. As you'll discover in your reading in your textbooks, if you have not done so already, Hebrews is a letter in which the author of the letter is seeking to show that the revelation of God made in and through his Son, Jesus Christ, is one that both completes and supersedes the revelation that God made in the Old Covenant via the law, the Torah, and the prophets, the Nevi'im. So in Hebrews chapter 1, the author begins with this foundational truth and this theme and centers what he has to say about the nature of the Son and the way in which the revelation of the Son supersedes the revelation made through the law and the prophets in the Old Testament. Hebrews 1 begins with these words: "In many and various ways, God spoke of old to our fathers by the prophets. But in these last days he has spoken to us by his Son, whom he appointed the heir of all things, through whom also he created the world." This sentence in my translation in the RSV or the NRSV it comprises verses 1 and verse 2. It is a long single sentence. It's carefully constructed, and it serves as a topic or thematic sentence, not only for the first section of Hebrews, but for the whole work. And in some ways, this tells us that the letter to the Hebrews is a piece of rhetoric, begins with its proposition. There is no introduction. There is no standard epistolary opening, letter opening, which contains the name of the author and the name of the intended recipients and a word of greeting. But instead, what we find is a proposition that begins in the first two verses. B.F. Westcott, in his classic commentary on the Epistle of the Hebrews, notes this same thing and says that the first words of this letter give us, and I'm quoting now, a summary view of the main subject, which is the finality of the absolute revelation in Christ as contrasted with the preparatory revelation under the Old Covenant. This long sentence divides into two halves. Each of them is worth looking at carefully, and so we're going to do that. But there'll be some intermixing back and forth as we go along. The opening sentence begins with a prepositional phrase, "in the past." This prepositional phrase, all by itself, begins to suggest or imply some kind of movement between past and present, and perhaps even some kind of contrast between them. Then comes the subject and the verb. God is the subject. Spoke is the verb. And this is the central theme, not only of this sentence, and not only of chapter 1, but of all of Hebrews. The fact that God has spoken, the fact that God has revealed himself. As Francis Schaeffer, a 20th century theologian, said, God is there and God is not silent. God's revelation is the way in which we come to know who God is and obtain the ability to relate to God. This is true of all our relationships. Until someone speaks, we do not truly know them. And so the central theme of Hebrews is that God has spoken. And it tells us what God has revealed, what God has said. The next phrase is also a prepositional phrase. In the past, that's the first prepositional phrase. God spoke, that's the subject and the verb. Then comes the prepositional phrase, to our ancestors. And this phrase suggests a continuity between past and present, but also the same kind of discontinuity that we hear in the first prepositional phrase, in the past. Then come two Greek expressions. At many times, underlying the English is the Greek word polymeros. At many times is really in many pieces, in many parts. According to the Old Testament, God speaks on more than 1,000 separate occasions over a period of at least 4,000 years. Many times, many parts. Polymeros. Polymeros suggests the fragmentary nature of God's speech in the Old Testament. And then comes the word in various ways. Polytropos. in various kinds, in many fragments, in many fashions. Tom Long, in his commentary on Hebrews, makes a list of some of the ways that God speaks in the Old Testament. Here are some of them. Direct speech. God reveals himself through his actions. That's a form, a way of God's speaking, God's revealing himself. Handwriting on a wall in the book of Daniel. Dictation, dreams, visions, appearances, theophanies. God speaks through animals, speaks through the donkey that Balaam is riding, telling Balaam that he may not curse God's people Israel. God speaks through object lessons. He sends Jeremiah to a potter's house. God speaks through lots that were cast to determine God's will in the Old Testament. And God speaks in the Old Testament through songs, through poems, through proverbs, through prophecies, and most significantly for the writer of the Hebrews, through angels. But the many ways and the various ways that God has spoken or revealed himself to his people, to our ancestors, the book of Hebrews says, suggests that none of them is complete in and of itself, and even suggests that the entirety of the Old Testament may not provide a conclusive or complete revelation of who God is and what God wants to say to us. And that impression is confirmed by the contrast that's now introduced in the second part of what Hebrews has to say in verses 1 and 2. In verse 2, we're introduced to a four-part contrast. The contrast is introduced, first of all, with a contrastive conjunction but, and then with a contrast with a prepositional phrase, in these last days, that contrasts in verse 2 with the prepositional phrase in verse 1, in the past. There's a contrast between in the past and in these last days. In verse 2, the phrase in these last days is standard messianic eschatological language, as a study of the phrase in the Old Testament proves. Here's one illustration from the book of Hosea, from chapter 3 and verses 4 and 5. It says, "For the Israelites will live many days without king or prince, without sacrifice or sacred stones, without ephod or household gods. Afterward, the Israelites will return and seek the Lord their God and David their king. They will come trembling to the Lord and to his blessing in the last days." In the last days, Hosea says. And his prophecy looks forward to those last days when the Israelites, the people of God, will seek the Lord their God and David their king. So in the past is contrasted with in these last days in verse 2. The contrast continues. To our ancestors is contrasted with to us. The ancestors are, of course, the people of God in the Old Testament, to whom God was revealed through the law and the prophets. And to us, of course, are those who are believers and followers of Jesus, like the author of the letter to the Hebrews and the audience to whom he's writing. And then comes another contrast. In verse 1, God spoke to God's people through the prophets. And now in verse 2, God speaks by his Son. The Son is both the content, the completion of God's revelation, the completion of its content, and the agent through which that completion of content is made known. So this is the first part of Hebrews chapter 1. Those first two verses form the proposition, as it were, of this letter. And we're going to go on in the next part of what I have to say to you in the next video and talk some more about Hebrews chapter 1.